Imagine, if you will, two birds flying up in the air, looking down on stuff, us, all around us. An eagle and a vulture. What do they see? They look very differently. Now, I don't want to, step on anybody who thinks that, all the pieces of nature are important, because I think they are, right? But they see something different, don't they? Each of us gets to choose in every moment what set of eyes we use. When we look at the world around us, the people around us, what are we seeing? Are we seen as an eagle? Are we seen as a vulture? Who and what do we see when we look? You see, I think that in each moment we get to choose how we identify not just ourselves, but how we identify them, whoever they are. Those others, those different, those that we're looking at. Last week I told you to look through the lens of prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness, so you could begin to see what it is that you could see differently. How in each moment can you see that through one of those lenses? And this week I want you to take that and apply it even more broadly, not just to individuals, but to life as a whole. How do we recapture and reinvigorate our vision for this world, not just as individuals, but as a church? About a month ago, several of us went to go see Brian McLaren speak up in Tempe. And he wrote this book called The Great Spiritual Migration: How the World's Largest Religion is Seeking a Better Way to Be Christian. Not a great title? The Great Spiritual Migration. And the problem is with migrations is that none of us easily go to a migration. We kind of like sitting where we're at. And migration says something about where you're at is not enough. Move somewhere. And the problem is that the reason why we're where we're at is because we have a good definition there. We understand why we're where we're at. But this year we sit in our 50th year. We get to decide in this moment, this pivotal moment, how do we continue to see ourselves? What do we take from the past and move forward? And what do we set aside and adopt something new? What do we become for the next 50 years? And Brian McLaren in this book talks about how the whole of the Bible is a story of people on the move. Going from one reality to a new reality. From one set of relationships to a new set of relationships. Forever trying to redefine what it is they can and ought to be. And it continually asks this question: who are we now? Because if you don't realize it already, you should know that very often what we say is, please leave me alone. But God keeps asking, who are you now? Who do you need to be in this moment with this person? And the problem with any definition, no matter how good it is that it limits us from being able to see beyond that definition. But God's definition for us always moves us somewhere. And it's that somewhere that's the challenge, isn't it? Because sometimes it's not within my definition. Sometimes it's undefined in front of me. Sometimes I'm wondering if I want to or can go that way. But God's definition moves us somewhere. Can I take a moment and critique St. Francis? I've been here a couple of years now. Our definition of self has often been in opposition to other. Right? We don't want to be like that, like them. Right? And we have good reason for that, because we've seen the way some of those thems have abused, misused, misdefined what religion should be, what church should be. How many of you have been hurt somewhere? And here you found a space where you found a place of safety, of grace, of love. That's a good thing. That's our good definition of self. But what it sometimes caused us to do is to say, all right, we're not like them. And it set us in a space where we too easily separated ourselves from all of that. It caused us to sometimes revel in our uniqueness and distance ourselves from too many others. We're the only ones who do this, right? How many know that's not quite a good definition? Especially when it comes down to any sense that we have to protect ourselves from them. The reason I'm critiquing this isolationism is because I think that God is calling us to see a larger picture than just that. To move beyond what was important at the time. And let me tell you that it was really important. What you have been is incredible. You provided that space of safety. Now it's time to take that space of safety into a larger space. To find more people to be in that circle. To figure out how to translate this vision, which has done such remarkable things here, into a space beyond here. Because you know what? There's a lot of people right now in our world that need to hear exactly the message that has been heard in these walls. There's a lot of people that need to know of the love and the grace that has been found here. And I think it's time for us to hear a voice that calls us to more than just what we have been. Brian McLaren says that we have to migrate from this space to wherever it takes us, to where God is redefining what spirituality is. And to do that, we have to ask 3 questions. Who's ahead of me? Who are the ones who taught us what to be what we are? You got them in your heads? Some amazing people that taught us to be so incredible, that taught us how to love so well. Then the second question is, who walks beside us? Who are the companions we take on the journey that we're walking into? And it's really simple to look around the room and say, well, I take these folks. But who else? Who else might be our companions on this journey? Anyone who was in our class this summer over at St. Mark's saw some incredible companions for the journey. Across denominations, across religions, we realized there were kindred hearts and hearts that we needed to both learn from and teach. The companions are always larger than what we've already defined. But to get there, we have to ask the third question. Who's behind us? Who teaches us to move forward? Who are our mentors who help us to be able to take those next steps? Because the problem with the next steps is that it's walking towards something we don't know well, something that challenges us, something that makes it so that we want to stop and retreat back to what we have been. So who are we going to choose to help us go forward? History, companions, mentors, all important to get us to where we need to go. And it'll take us on a journey that will seem sometimes remarkably weird, strange, unlike what we've been, but will bring us into something that will be one of the greatest celebrations that we've had. Because we'll be going right where Spirit is leading. I watched that a couple weeks ago. I told you about that big pink walk I was on. Susan B. Komen, all these people walking 60 miles in 3 days, and how they came from so many different spaces, so many different reasons for being there, but somehow in that space found a way to do church together, found a companionship and a meaning for who they were and who they could be. That's what we're trying to figure out. The problem is there's so many reasons why we don't get into that situation. Michelle Obama this week talked about one of those reasons and about how we need to, none of us should be on the side that denigrates women, causes violence towards women. And that's something that all of us should believe in. All of us should embrace, but it's so easy because of politics or whatever to start saying, I don't want to listen to that voice. Or to find someone else who doesn't want to. And there's so many issues like that we've turned into that which causes us to oppose each other instead of allowing our hearts to grow together. And so we so easily divide ourselves one from another. And at the base of all of those divisions is one insidious factor. And you know what it is? Fear. Fear. We look at each other and we worry. We fret. We run away from. Rolling Stone magazine this month had an amazing article that said why we're living in an age of fear. And it was written by Neil Strauss, and I'm going to, I understand that not all of you are brain scientists, and so I'm going to, I'm not going to talk like the scientist that I know I am, and that I know everything about, the brain. So, if I don't quite sound like a scientist, it's because I'm trying to do that. And what this talks about is the amygdala. The amygdala is a small part in each hemisphere of the brain that has often been called the space where fear comes from. It's a home of our emotional responses. And Daniel Goldman says that he coined this term that he called amygdala hijacking to describe what inflammatory rhetoric and imagery are designed to do. Trigger the emotional brain before the logical brain has a chance to stop it. And how so that it's to to describe what inflammatory rhetoric and imagery are designed to do. Trigger the emotional brain before the logical brain has a chance to stop it. And so we say all these things and do all those things which make us move forward sometimes in ways that we shouldn't. And here's the bottom line. That's what each side in a political debate thinks the other side is doing. In arguments where we get on different sides of each other, we think that you're reacting to fear and I'm not. But that amygdala means we're all reacting. And Joseph Ledoux asserts that the fear doesn't actually occur in the amygdala. That the reality is what's there is a threat detection and response space. A space that's designed to give us anxiety, not fear. To make us prepare to say, should I do something? And yet we interpret it more and more as I should run from, I should fight against. We interpret it as the fear that is already there instead of just the possibility. What we're talking about is anxiety, not fear. Fear is a response to the present threat. Anxiety is a more complex and highly manipulable response to something I anticipate might be a threat in the future. But we act as though it's already a threat. Have you seen that in someone else around you? Have you done that to someone around you? In 1998, a researcher called Pazensky did this study on aggression. And his basic question is, how much hot sauce can the participant make someone else eat? Someone who doesn't want hot sauce, right? And so their job was to feed the other person hot sauce. But then the difference is that with some of the participants, they began talking about death. And some of the participants, they didn't. And the ones who they talked about death, the ones who they talked to them about death, they fed so much more hot sauce to the people, especially if they saw that person as being on the other side. I mean, they were just like jamming it down their throat almost. Because they felt that threat of death. And so they were willing to be aggressive towards this person who was different. Is that an incredible study? But how often are we guilty of doing that same thing? We feel the threat and we begin to react to it to the people around us. How often do we let that amygdala take over? And here's the really bad thing about it. When we do that, this part of our brain, this part that does the thinking, this part that we really need a lot, that helps us in so many ways, when we allow that amygdala to take over, this part shrinks. And the amygdala gets larger and larger. And we see more and more reasons to fear, to be anxious, to run away from each other. And politicians and salespeople regularly use this to influence our behavior. And we buy into it. We buy into it in so many different ways. We tell each other stories of why we should be afraid of somebody, somewhere. And that anxiety that comes out of the amygdala is the really bad part. Is that there's a superhighway between it and the parts of the brain that represent the symbols and the faces that we see. And that can become so ingrained that which started as anxiety can become real fear. And they can form so strongly that they are hard to undo. How many know at least one person where that's true? If like-minded people get together and talk and share too much, you know what happens? The ideas we hold become deeper and stronger and more polarizing. That's called the law of group polarization. So the solution to that is a simple thing. We have to connect in larger ways than we think. Because if I just connect to people who think like me, amygdalas grow and fears deepen. I have to, in order to correct this, both in myself and in the other, I have to talk to those who are fear-invoking to me. Fear divides us on a regular basis. And that fear makes the fear itself grow. But you know the solution. In 1 John it says, love takes out any fear. And perfect love takes out all fear. And you found that here, haven't you? That's been one of the gifts that we've given to each other here, is we provided a space of love for each other. And we found a space where we didn't have to fear. And I got to tell you that you're not all the same. And there's reasons why you might be fearful of each other, but instead you've chosen love. You've chosen to say that's more important than whatever could be the fearsome things between us. have to spread that. I think what you have learned here and what you've become here is what our country needs today. You know the number one thing that people do to when they feel anxious? The number one way they try to fix their anxiety? Any guess?
Eat, drink.
They vote. They vote. That's how people think they fix their anxiety. But how do we usually vote? Let me get the bums out. Right? We vote again for what we're against. The two other things that are the highest ranked things is they go and buy a security alarm system. And third, they go and buy a gun. All of those things are ways of pushing each other away, protecting ourselves in some way or another, fixing it in our way of being. They're ways of following that great philosophy called, hey you, get off of my cloud. That's the great philosophers, the Rolling Stones, in case you didn't recognize. But our job is to say something different and new, and it was what was spoken in Jeremiah. There was that old covenant, that old way of seeing something, but I'm bringing something new. How do we help each other not to see the fear that is so easy for them to see, but to see something different? It will not be like the old covenant. It will be something new. And did you hear what happens in that newness? Every single person has God in their heart. It doesn't happen from out here, this direction of how God works. It happens from inside. Now we kind of say that here, don't we? That I see the light of God in you. I look and I recognize God and Christ living there inside of you. I see Spirit moving through you. But how many have a little bit harder time out there sometimes? Our job, I think, the gift of what St. Francis has been and can continue to be, is to try to figure out how to take what we've done here and move it out there somewhere. So that somebody who right now we see as an enemy, we can somehow see presence of God in them. Somehow we can find the person who feels like they are stepping on us in some way or another, and we can speak God's presence in them so well that they hear it. Because it feels like they're not right now. They're so busy protecting themselves that it feels like they don't sometimes trust God. But maybe it's because we're not seeing God in them enough. This scripture in Jeremiah was written at a pivotal time in Israel's history. It was a time when everything was falling apart. Not unlike today. Right? Where it feels like we're splitting and going each in a million different ways. And the divides between us are growing larger and larger. And for Jeremiah, it was very true, those divides, because Babylon had come in and taken people off into captivity. And they were far away. In fact, one of Jeremiah's contemporaries, Ezekiel, was off in Babylon. And guess what? The stuff Jeremiah was writing and the stuff Ezekiel was writing from two different places, they were finding different solutions. They were looking at, Ezekiel was saying, someday we'll get home. We've got to go back. And Jeremiah was sitting in Jerusalem going, yeah, I don't want to come here. God is there. And it was perspective that was in the way. And you see, that's where we're at sometimes now. And yet we see our perspective so well that we don't see what it is that the other person's seeing. We don't see why it is that they're seeing God very differently than what we see. But McLaren says, religion is best when it leads us forward towards something that helps us to see better. Joshua Correll was quoted in this article about 2 solutions that he gave. First of all, he said we should be mixing things up more. Whatever your prevalent group, whoever it is that you typically hang out with, is not what you should hang out with alone. I mean, you should continue to have that group, but you need to have a larger group. The more diverse group you have, the more people of different sorts that you invite into that group, the more your fear will go down. And the fear of others will go down. The more we connect on the larger scale and, in St. Francis' language, see the Spirit in them, the easier that Spirit will grow in us and in them. And the second thing that it says we have to do is what's called agency. We get to choose in every moment. He says your capacity to exert your own power on your environment is important. Learn to have a degree of acceptance around uncertainty and ambiguity. Learn to feel comfortable with change and seek to understand things you may be afraid of rather than withdrawing from them. In our statement of beliefs, our philosophy, there's an amazing line. None of us are saved until all are saved. That's incredible. Because how many know, at least some people, that it's really hard for you to want to be with them for eternity. Right? And yet that's our ultimate goal, is to say all of us have to move forward together or none of us truly can move forward. All of us have to move. But to do that, we have to sometimes take the road less traveled. The one that's harder for us to see or want to see. Do we trust the person on the other side of that divide, whether it be political or economic or even violent? Do we trust the God in that person enough to continue to walk with them somehow? Do we trust that God is speaking into their life in some way or another? McLaren asked this question: do we make the minimum necessary change or the maximum possible? Look at your life. Ask about those things, those prayers, those presents, those gifts, those service. Ask where it is that you can somehow connect with somebody and heal some of this. How can you reach beyond what would drive you apart and somehow or another see God in that other person? How is it that we as a church can move towards becoming that which heals the huge, enormous wounds that lie in our society today? How is it that we move together towards that space we call God? When we do that, when we figure that out, those answers, we will truly be the people of God here on earth. Amen? Amen.